I've been saying from the beginning in this series that the church is necessary for the world. The world needs us to be the people God has called us to be. And for us to be the church that the world needs us to be, there are things that we must do, things that are necessary for us to do. And if we don't do those things, then the world misses out and we miss out. And on the very first day, I said that one of those things, maybe the most foundational of those things, is that we must be about our Father's business, just like Jesus had to be about our Father's business. And that business is the business of reconciliation. And we looked at nuances of that, and we've really zeroed in on this idea of love and this need to love. That as followers of Jesus, we must work, and the work we have to do is the work of love. But love is not easy. Love is hard, and often when we love, we don't receive love in return. That comes with the territory. It's kind of like the parable of the sower. You remember the parable of the sower. The sower went out sowing the seed and just throwing seed everywhere, throwing seed all over the place. Some of the seed landed on the path. It got trampled on. It didn't grow. Some of the seed landed among thorns and it grew, but it got choked out by the weeds. Some of the seed landed on stony ground and it grew up, but it didn't have deep roots. So when the sun came out, it just withered and died. And some of the seed landed on good soil and bore fruit. Loving as Jesus loved is like that some of that love that we sow out into the lives of others, that we pour into the lives of others, some of it comes back to us in love. But much of it, maybe most of it doesn't. The question is, what do we do when it's hard to love, when there are obstacles to loving, and even when people we're trying to love don't want it. They just want to push back, or they'll take the love, but they don't want to give any love back. What do we do in those kind of situations? Then we got to look at what Jesus is doing. And we got to say that one of the things as followers of Jesus that we must do is we must persevere. We must persevere. Jesus, his whole extraordinary story of persevering through the ages, I want to review that this morning because we got a snapshot of it this morning. And I just want to read a couple of verses again. As Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem, and Pharisees came and they said, hey, don't go to Jerusalem. Herod's going to kill you. And Jesus said, tell that fox, I'll keep on driving out demons and healing people today and tomorrow, and on the third day, I will reach my goal. Jesus is not saying I'm only 3 days away from Jerusalem. Jesus is speaking metaphorically here about his death and his resurrection. But he's not speaking metaphorically about the fact that he's going to keep doing these things. I will keep driving out demons. I will keep healing people. And he said, in any case, I must press on today, tomorrow, and the next day. For surely no prophet can die outside Jerusalem. I must press on, Jesus said. I must persevere. I must keep loving, even in the face of the threat of death. I must keep loving, even if people aren't returning the love. I must keep loving, even if they're not responding to the love. I've got to keep taking these actions. I've got to keep healing people. I've got to keep freeing people from spiritual darkness that's enslaving them or destroying their lives or their relationships. I've got to keep doing these actions of love today, tomorrow, and the next day until I reach my goal. And what is that goal? What is that goal? Because Jesus' perseverance, I think this is extra. If we were just talking about Jesus' traveling to Jerusalem to die on the cross and then rise again, that would be an extraordinary story of perseverance, given what he had to persevere through. But it's more than that. He had a lifetime of loving folks with them out, without them understanding them. But it's even more than Jesus' decades of physical life on the earth as one of us. When we talk about Jesus' goal, his goal was not the cross. That was just a stopping point along the way. If we want to see Jesus' goal, let's jump all the way to Revelation. I want to read you a few verses from the end of Revelation. It's John's vision. John was given a vision by God of what where all of this was going, of what the climax to the story is. Crucifixion was not the climax. The resurrection wasn't even the climax. Where all of this is going, the climax of all of this, John had this vision of the end of times after war was put to an end, after all the enemies were defeated, after disease and poverty and addiction and greed and violence and hatred and division, after all of that was cast out, what's the final goal? And this is what John saw. He said, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, dressed beautifully for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.' One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls full of 7 last plagues came and said to me, 'Come, and I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb.' And he carried me away in the Spirit to a mountain great and high, and showed me the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. And it shone with the glory of God. And its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal." This is the goal. This is the climax. Unity with God. Community with God. God dwelling with his people in the love and connection and deep connection of a beautiful and loving husband with a beautiful and loving wife. Together. Together. That's the goal. That we would remember Jesus, the business Jesus was about reconciling the world to God through himself. And in John, we get the vision of what that reconciliation looks like in the end, that God dwells among us and lives among us, and we are deeply connected. Deep covenantal love, like a good relationship between a good husband and a good wife. That's the goal. And that's where it's going. And that had always been the goal. Jesus' story of perseverance isn't just from his birth till at least 2,023 years later when the kingdom comes. We don't know when that's going to happen. We don't. Could be another 100 years, could be another 10,000 years. We don't know. But it's not just that. It goes all the way back to the beginning. Because this was God's goal from the beginning. God created humanity and made us different than every other aspect of creation. God created everything, created all the animals, the fish and the animals on, like the 5th day. It was the 6th day. It was a completely separate act of creation when God made humanity. And breathed into us his own breath, his own spirit, and made us to be like him. No other aspect of creation was given this. No one. And then remember when Adam and Eve were in the garden, and they'd eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They'd eaten that fruit that God said, "Don't eat that, you're going to mess everything up. It only leads to death." And they did it anyway. They wanted life on their own terms. And then they said they heard God walking in the garden in the cool of the evening. Now, Amy and I have been married for 28 years now. And when I'm in a room, even if I can't see her, I know by the way, man, I don't know why I'm having such a hard time saying it. I know what my wife's walk sounds like, right? I can tell, it's distinct to me. When the family's all together and I can hear my son, daughter, other family members, they have their own things. I don't necessarily pick them out, but when I hear my wife walking through a room, I know it's my wife. She's got a walk that to me is very distinct because we have spent so much time together and paid such attention to each other. Adam and Eve didn't see God to know he was there. They just heard him, and they knew it was God. They recognized God just by the way he walked. The implication here is that this was not the first time God had walked in the garden with Adam and Eve. that this was a regular thing. God made them to be in fellowship with him, to be connected with him. From the beginning, humanity, God's intention was for humanity to be the bride of Jesus Christ. I have a good friend. She has been a good friend to me. We have not had physical contact, like face-to-face. We haven't seen each other for many, many years. Her name is Paulette Schroeder. I call her Sister Paulette, not because she's my biological sister, and not even because it's like, well, brother and sister so-and-so. She's an actual sister. She's a sister of St. Francis. She is a nun. She spends part of her time in Tiffin, where there is a convent there, the Sisters of St. Francis. She spends part of her time in Palestine and Israel working for peace over there in a very difficult situation. And she's been doing that for decades. And she's an amazing woman. I had a conversation with her once, and she said something to me as we were talking about Jesus and who Jesus was and why he came. And I said something about Jesus coming because of our sin. Jesus came to earth because of our sin. And Sister Paulette looked at me and she said, Scott, said, Jesus would have come even if we hadn't sinned. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I didn't really know what to say to it. I hadn't really thought about it before, but I have not been able to stop thinking about that reality. But I believe Paulette is absolutely right. God came to the garden with humanity before there was sin. And Jesus was always going to come. Jesus, because God wanted that close, deep, personal connection with us. He wanted that. From the beginning, the intention was for humanity to be the bride of his son, Jesus. And the miracle is not that Jesus came because of our sin, but that Jesus came even though we sinned. Think about it this way. We were created to be covenantal companions with God. Imagine you're engaged. You go on away for a trip, for business, for whatever, you're gone for 2 months. While you're gone, you hear reports and then see video on Twitter or Facebook or wherever of your intended spouse acting the fool in all sorts of ways with all sorts of different people while you're gone. They're sleeping around, they're partying, they're doing this, they're doing everything with a lot of other people that they should only be doing with their spouse. If I had done that to Amy while we were engaged, there would never have been a wedding. I guarantee you, and rightly so. Amy would have said, no, I'm not coming back to that. You're going to do that, you go your own way. You're on your own. Go. That's what Jesus did. Jesus came anyway. The story of Hosea, the book of Hosea, I think is one of the most powerful and important books in the Bible. I believe the church has misused it grossly over the years. It's usually been used, as I've heard it over the years, as a book to beat up women over issues of sexual ethics. That's not why the book of Hosea was written there. And there's not a book in the Bible that was written so we could beat anyone up for anything. And that's certainly not why Hosea was written. Hosea, I also have to say, I'm really glad that I was not called to be a prophet at the time of the Old Testament prophets. God asked those folks to do for him things that would be really, really hard for me to do. There was at one point where he told Isaiah, you just need to live naked in the community for a while because I got a lesson for everyone around that they're only going to learn by seeing you walk around naked all the time. Thank you. No, thank you. I'm so glad. He asked Hosea to do something that I imagine was much harder than what he asked Isaiah to do. He said, Hosea, I need people to see how much I love them and how much I'm committed to them. And for them to really understand that, they need to see a living example of that. And for that living example, Hosea, I need you to marry a prostitute. I need you to marry a prostitute. And he told his prophet Hosea to marry a prostitute, not a former prostitute, not someone who had been a prostitute and had said, I'm done with that lifestyle, I need to live differently now, an active prostitute. And he said to Hosea, you need to provide for her everything she needs. Provide for her like a good and loving husband ought to provide for his wife. Provide her with shelter, provide her with clothing, provide her with food, provide her with all that she needs to live a comfortable, peaceful, prosperous life. But she's still going to be prostituting herself. And when she gets in trouble and she gets in debt to her Johns, and she's stuck with them because, now she owes them money, you need to go pay her debts and free her from those folks to come back and be your wife. And by the way, she's going to keep doing that. And God said, Hosea, I need you to do that because that's how my people have been to me. I created them. I gave them life. I put them in a garden to begin with. And they said, no, thank you, God. We'd rather do life our way rather than your ways. They round up in slaves in Egypt, and I rescued them from that. I freed them from that. I took them into a land and gave them everything they needed there. And I drove out their enemies before them. But instead of coming to me for comfort and security and prosperity and hope and peace and joy, they're going to every other source they can find. All of these false gods, all of these other nations, all of the big one, the one that's named there in Hosea is Baal. I have no idea if that's how you pronounce it. I've heard the name pronounced a lot of different ways. But if you've read the Old Testament, you've probably come across that name, one of the chief gods of that region. And Baal was a god of prosperity. And Israel kept going to all of these other things for prosperity, for security. When they were threatened, instead of going to God, they would go to the Egyptians, or they would go to the Babylonians, or they would go to the Persians, or they would go to all of these other sources for peace and prosperity and comfort. And God said, I'm your God. Come to me for that. And they said, we don't really need you. We're happy to have you, God, but not exclusively you. And God said, this is my life, Hosea, that my people, my bride, keep prostituting themselves out to all of these other things and all of these other people and all of these other gods, and I keep on loving them. The miracle of Jesus' incarnation is not that he came because of our sin, but that he came even though we had sinned. He could have washed his hands from us. He could have said, I don't know, what's the old joke that, you brought you into this world, I can take you out and make another one just like you. God could literally do that. He could have wiped everyone out and said, I'm starting over from scratch. I don't need this from these folks. I'll get a group of people that really will be pure and loving and holy for me. But instead, Jesus came anyway. He persevered through all of that opposition, through all of that rejection, through all of that infidelity, and said, I will love you anyway. Anyway. Listen, these are the verses from Hosea that I think say it beautifully. And he said, for on that day, says the Lord, you will call me my husband and no longer call me my Baal. For I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, and they will be mentioned they shall be mentioned by name no more. I will make for you a covenant on that day with the wild animals, the birds of the air, and the creeping things on the ground. And I will abolish the bow and the sword and war from the land, and I will make you lie down in safety, and I will take you for my wife forever. I will take you for my wife in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love and in mercy. I will take you for my wife in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. I got to think that these verses from Hosea were in the back of John's mind when he saw the bride of Jesus descending from the heavens. God's people coming together with God's Son. That was the plan from the beginning. And no, even though we got so far off course, and we have, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Every single one of us. Every single one of us. And even when Jesus came, he was not hailed and welcomed as God. God, you still came. I can't believe you came in all this mess. We're so glad that you came. They said, that's not God. That's evil. He's not God. He's a heretic. Kill him. Get him out. We don't want him around. They couldn't even recognize their own betrothed. And we wouldn't have done any better. At least I would not have done any better. And even those who did say, okay, this Jesus, he's the Messiah. He's God's anointed one. He's God's chosen. He's God's Messiah. They still didn't get him. They still didn't understand him. And when the rubber hit the road and the fat hit the fan and things started to get bad, they just bolted. They took off and ran away and abandoned him. And Jesus persevered in love anyway. Anyway. Our sin didn't make Jesus come to earth. That gives too much power to us and to our sin. Jesus was coming anyway, and he came even though we sinned. Even though we had messed ourselves up in such a big way. And here's the reality. If Jesus' extraordinary story of persevering through the ages is our example and we're following him, that means, already did those. That means as followers of Jesus, we must persevere in loving God and others just like Jesus did. If Jesus has persevered, how can we give up? We've got to love others like Jesus did. We've got to keep loving. And we could love some, and we'll love folks, and we'll pour love on them, and we'll pour good things on them, and we'll meet needs, and those practical and felt needs we talked about last week, we'll do those things, and there'll be no love in return. Sometimes there'll be even rejection and hatred. That's what happened to Jesus. And he kept loving anyway. And sometimes folks will pour out love on them and they'll love in return. And it'll be wonderful, it'll be beautiful, and we'll come together and it'll all be good. And that'll be great. But that's not the way it always is. And so the question for us then is, will we persevere in loving? Will we persevere in loving? It's a hard thing to do. And even if we decide to do it, we're going to mess it up. I got a video. At this point in the sermon, I showed a video that I'm not licensed to include in digital distribution, so I'll just tell you about it. It shows two, air quotes, Christians who are trying to love their neighbor but making a real mess of it. It's a great and humorous example of how not to love. If you'd like to watch it, I've included a link in the description. All right. No matter how bad you mess up, I got a hunch we're not going to get it that bad. They were way out of touch in so many ways. But we're going to mess up. We try. We're broken people. We have sin in our life. And even as followers of Jesus, we will make mistakes. His disciples made mistakes. Paul made mistakes. Saul, before he was Paul, he was called Saul. And he was so intent on serving God that he was imprisoning and killing Christians, killing Jesus' followers, because he thought that's what God would want him to do. And then Jesus didn't give up on Saul. He came to Saul, knocked him off his horse, blinded him for a while with his eyes so he could begin to see how blind he was in his spirit. And he loved him. He kept loving him. He persevered in loving him, even when Saul was not loving in return. That's what Jesus calls us to do. It's the way he calls us to live. And sometimes it'll be amazing, and sometimes it won't. Sometimes it'll be joyful, and sometimes it'll be painful. One of my greatest examples in all of this, or to me is a great example in all of this, is the story of Les Miserables. It's a book by Victor Hugo. It's a stage musical, Broadway. You can watch the movie version of the musical with Hugh Jackman. There are movies that aren't musicals, one starring Liam Neeson. In all of them, Jean Valjean is the main character. And Jean Valjean, he gets sent to prison for a petty crime. He stole bread to feed his starving family. And he was sent to 5 years of hard labor. And while he was in prison for a petty crime, he became a real criminal. He killed a man in prison in self-defense and he tried to escape, and he got another 5 years added on. So after 10 years, he's set free, but he's a parolee and he can't get a job anywhere. No one will hire him. No one wants him around. No one wants to be near him. Till he winds up in a small town. He's got to travel across the country to see his parole officer by a certain date. If he doesn't get there in time, he violates parole and he goes back to prison. And he winds up sleeping or trying to sleep on a bench in this little town. And he's told, hey, you can't sleep there. And he said, I got no place else to sleep. And he said, if you think you've got no place to sleep, then you haven't been to the bishop's house, because the bishop will take in anybody. Bishop Bienvenu is my hero. He's the kind of pastor, I want to be like him. When I grow up as a pastor, I want to be like Bishop Bienvenu. And he took in anybody. And in where he lived and where he lived in a rectory, and there were other folks that lived there, servants of the church that also assisted the bishop, and they kind of thought Bishop Bienvenu was a little crazy and a little too radical and a little bit too fanatical, and he needed to be more careful and he needed to be more cautious. But when Valjean showed up on his step asking for a meal, the bishop invited him in, made him guest of honor at dinner. And his servant said, hey, if we're going to have this guy in here, we at least shouldn't put out the good silverware. Let's put out the old stuff. He's going to rob you blind, Bishop. And the bishop said, put out the good silverware. He's our guest of honor. And he gave Valjean a meal, and he ate with him. He dined with him. He welcomed him into his life, into his house. He gave him a place to sleep at night. And when they all went to bed, Valjean got up and robbed him blind. And when the bishop heard Valjean rummaging through the silverware, he got up to see what was going on, and Valjean hit him hard enough to knock him out. And then he left. And then a few hours later, Valjean was back, accompanied by soldiers who caught him and had the bag of silverware, and they said to the bishop, hey, don't worry, we caught this guy. He's got your silverware. He had the nerve to tell us that you gave it to him. And the bishop said, that's right. I did give it to him. And he looked at Valjean and he said, but how did you forgot the best part. The silver candlesticks, you forgot the silver candlesticks, Valjean. They're worth more than all the silverware combined. How could you forget them? And he stuffed the silver candlesticks into Valjean's bag. Then the bishop sent the soldiers off to get a drink, and he stayed with Valjean. Or rather, Valjean stayed with him. And Bishop Bienvenu said this to him, Jean Valjean, my brother, you no longer belong to evil, but to good. It is your soul that I buy from you. I withdraw it from black thoughts and the spirit of perdition, and I give it to God. The bishop persevered in loving. He kept loving, even when the love wasn't returned. And it wasn't an occasional, this is just how the bishop lived his life. Looking out for the needs of others, giving when others thought it was impractical or unsafe, welcoming people into his home when others thought it was impractical or unsafe. Loving people, many of whom never returned the love. But Valjean did. Valjean returned the love. He became an honest man. He used that wealth to make himself into a prosperous man who was also making other people prosperous too. He changed his name. He broke parole because there's nowhere he could have gone in the country with that silver as a parolee and not been thrown back into jail, and the bishop wouldn't always be there to bail him out. So he changed his name. He broke parole and lived a prosperous and peaceful life, helping others live prosperous and peaceful lives too, until he got the news that Jean Valjean had been arrested. Another man was arrested. He was mistaken for Jean Valjean, and he was going to be sent to prison and probably executed. And all Valjean had to do was let him go, and Valjean would have been safe forever. But instead, he went to the courthouse, and he stood before the judge, and he said, that man isn't Valjean the convict. I am Valjean the convict. He persevered in loving. Even when the cost was great, even when it was hard, even when that love might not be understood, received, returned, accepted, or even recognized. And this is the life that Jesus calls us to, this life of persevering love, no matter what. When we fail, Jesus still perseveres in loving us. The question is, will we persevere in loving others? As Valjean did, as Jesus did, as God has done for us from the beginning of time, will we persevere in loving others. In Jesus' name, amen.